Mike Shea here. I got Rob Wilkinson with me. We are the creators of Lady Lovecraft, and we're talking about making Lady Lovecraft, making comics, art, all kinds of fun stuff tonight. How you doing, Rob?
Doing pretty good tonight. How about you?
No, I'm not doing too bad. My kids are in bed, so let's see how long that lasts.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So, Rob, people who are watching this probably know I've been doing comics for a little while. I've been doing
Mhm.
Miskatonic High on Kickstarter. Along came Lady Lovecraft with some art by Rob Wilkinson. So
Mhm.
they probably know me. They probably don't know a whole lot about you. So why don't we start off by who are you? How'd you get into art?
Um, my great grandmother used to babysit me. She was an artist, and that kind of started rubbing off. She did a lot of more traditional kind of oil paints and stuff.
Mhm.
And then my older brother actually used to read a lot of comic books, and I started kind of getting introduced to that type of art.
Oh, nice.
And it just never really stopped from there. I just you know kind of kept going with it, and yeah.
What kind of comics did he read?
It was a lot of Marvel stuff. Not quite as much DC, although he did have some of those in there as well. But it was a lot of X Men, that kind of
Mhm.
thing.
Yeah. If it was Marvel from a certain age, it was almost completely X-Men.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, what sort of comics did you like that you sort of stole from him, or were there things that you more geared toward than he did, or how about that?
Um, a lot of it. I mean, when I was first growing up and kind of getting into comic books, the X Men was the big thing. Spider
Mhm.
Man. Um, I mean, I remember when Spider Man was like the little tiny clips in the newspapers, like
Mhm.
all that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah.
Um, the I think one of the biggest things that I kind of got into was years ago. Marvel had, especially, I think it centered primarily on X Men, but it was these trading cards.
Yeah.
And the
Okay.
vast majority of them were, I think it was like Tops or
Mhm.
Flair or whatever it was. But they had this incredible art by just
Mhm.
a huge variety of artists. And I remember, and it was funny, you said, stealing comics and stuff.
Mhm.
I remember, like, I used to go through and, like, all of his doubles that
Mhm.
he would get, I would just take and, like, pour over these things.
Right.
And I think that was kind of my first introduction into like comic books and comic book art
Mhm.
not just being like kind of this throwaway art. Like it could
Mhm.
be so much more.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah.
Well, and also I remember those cards. Like one of the cool thing about them was they were sort of an introduction for character too. It was
Oh
like,
yeah.
it's like here's on the front you got like the art, but on the back it was like, well, here's who they are, here's a little bit about them, here's like a quote or something. And some of them had like the cool statistics, like he's at power level
Yep.
9 and his flight level is only at 2 or something like that. And
Oh yeah.
you really sort of got an idea of like what the characters are, who they can, what they could do, stuff like that. I
Yeah,
was I
certainly.
was a fan of them myself, but for all the good geeky
Yeah.
reasons.
Fair enough.
Okay, so you've seen comic books as a kid.
Mhm.
At some point, probably like me and probably like a lot of other people, your interest started going into horror and darker material. And so how did that work for you?
I mean, the some of my earliest stuff going into like reading horror
Hmm.
was actually HP Lovecraft.
Hmm.
And it was funny because there was a guy that I had worked with, way, way back. I think I was doing landscape construction at that time,
Hmm.
but he would take and, actually use different references from HP Lovecraft when he was describing some horrible, disgusting thing on a job site.
Oh, that's awesome.
And he was like talking about it. He's like, oh, this weird gelatinous mass of mushrooms coming up under this plant. And when I and I'm like, dude, where are you coming up with these words?
Mhm.
And he referenced H.P. Lovecraft, and he's like, oh, you got to read this guy's stuff. It's incredible. And sure enough, I ended up looking into it, and just the way he described things
Mhm.
just really pulled me in, because there's some artists, some writers, rather, that they they describe things to death,
Mhm.
and they almost go too far into it, so that you're reading so much that you kind of lose that visceral, like, you don't stay in the moment.
Yeah.
And one of the things with H.P. Lovecraft that I've always enjoyed is, yes, he's really wordy, and he's very, gets into it and use all the, like, big crazy words and whatnot.
Mhm.
But you never really get to the point where you're not in the moment.
Right.
But yeah, that was kind of how I got into all, horror writing, or rather reading.
Right. Well, one of the things that I always liked about Lovecraft, and especially his descriptions, is he leaves some of it still to the imagination. Like, he
Yeah.
only
Oh
goes
yeah.
so far. It's like, the one that I recall is when he was describing Cthulhu, is like, he's like a man, but not like a man. He's got wings, but he's not like a bat, or it's all these things, but not like those things. So in your head, you're sort of forced to figure out a way to put these things together, and you know anybody's
Yeah.
vision of it is correct, because he never is completely, like, pencil perfect about what it is.
Yeah, and I definitely agree that that's like one of the really beautiful things about his work, is
Mhm.
that, yeah, it kind of, it leaves just enough margin
Mhm.
for you to just pretty much inevitably imagine the single most horrifying thing to your own senses.
Yeah.
And I've always kind of enjoyed that. And I think, when I illustrate monsters,
Mhm.
that's one of those weird things that you try figuring out, like, what's the most terrifying, and what's the most, and sometimes just the fact that you have to, you know put it on a page itself, you're kind of, there's always that fear that you're like, well, maybe it'd be a little bit more terrifying if I didn't
Yeah.
show that, or if I,
Mhm.
but yeah, such is life, I guess.
Right. The suggestion is a lot of times more scary than seeing the specific.
Certainly, certainly.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. Um, so for a lot of people, they don't know how you and I got together and started making a comic. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
My recollection is, by that point, we were promoting Miskatonic High pretty heavily on social media.
Yeah,
And you are a big guy on Instagram. I had seen a
I
lot of your
tried.
work and liked a lot of your work, and so that's why I was following you. And at one point, I think you approached me and said, "Hey, you like Lovecraft? What can I draw?"
Yeah.
And I think at the time, and probably almost any time when anyone comes up to me and says, "Hey, what can I draw that's like Lovecraft based?" I always go to Innsmouth, because that's like my favorite.
Yeah.
And you went off and started drawing it, and that was like, nobody had ever done that, just come up to me and said, "Hey, what can I draw?" And I thought that was so amazing. I was like, "Okay, when's the price tag gonna show up?"
um I'll be honest, for me,
Mhm.
art has always been more compulsion than paycheck.
Mhm.
And
Welcome to
certainly as I
comics.
get older, yeah, like,
Yeah.
as I get older, and as I get further into the, arts and whatnot, like,
Mhm.
yeah, there is a certain amount of practicality where you got to figure out, like, okay, like, I got to make this pay for itself.
Right.
But the biggest thing was, if I'm being completely honest, I was, looking into Miskatonic High, this kind of thing.
Mhm.
And I was just kind of thinking to myself, I'm like, "Yeah, that seems like a really cool concept. Like I've always liked comic book art and I've always liked HP Lovecraft and
Mhm.
like that type of horror. And I thought to myself, I'm like, you know what? Like I've got couple slow days at the shop.
Mhm.
I'm all caught up on my tattoo design. That's my full-time job is tattooing.
Mhm.
Um, but I was like, I'm all caught up on everything. Why don't I take and, check in with this guy and see if there's anything I can draw for him?
Mhm.
And I'll be honest, at first it was like I wasn't really worried about getting paid for it. I wasn't
Mhm.
really worried about um, whether or not it would go very far. It was just again like just art by compulsion.
Right.
And anybody that's ever had, or rather any artist that's ever had artist block, sometimes the best thing to do is just to look at somebody who you think has similar interests and just be
Mhm.
like, hey dude, what should I draw?
Right.
And sometimes that, just that little spark is enough to kind of set you off in a direction.
Mhm.
And that was pretty much it.
Right, and I gotta tell you, so the way I come at it is,
Mhm.
like, I really respond to artists. There's some people who immediately go to an artist and say, "Here, draw me this exact thing in this exact pose with breasts, this big." And, that's not my thing. Like, I'm more interested in what an artist is gonna bring rather than them trying to get exactly what I want. So, like, it's kind of for me, it's much more like writing prompts, where you're given,
Yeah.
like, one line or a couple of words, and then you give it to the artist, and they go off and they do it. And I really respond to people's creativity and people who are
Mhm.
interested in experimenting and just drawing, and again, not worrying about the paycheck or what the end result is going to be. The process, the creation of it is really the fun part of it. And
Yeah.
I think that's something that I really responded to with your work. And especially once we started talking and found that we had a bunch of shared interests, it made perfect sense. So you drew the Innsmouth drawing for us, which we ran
Mhm.
in the comic, and then you had this picture and of this woman, and we didn't have a name for her or anything like that. And I think you
Yeah.
had drawn her, and we're talking maybe about a T-shirt or something. And I asked you if I could
Yeah.
run it as a cover on our comic book, and you were like, "Yeah,
Sure. Yeah.
right." And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I thought that was really cool because a lot of people, they're not that cool when you go to them and you say, "Hey, can I use this?" And they're like, "What's in it for me?" So I'm kind of curious,
Yeah.
like when people come to you and say, "Hey, this is art is really cool. Can I use it for this?" Or, "I really like this art." What's your kind of reaction to that?
Um, I'll be honest, usually if it's a case where they just appreciate the art,
Mhm.
and I'm trying to think how to put it. With me being a tattoo artist, a lot of the times, like I'll just create art hoping that it does something,
Mhm.
hoping that somebody looks at it and says like, "Ooh, I want that."
Right.
So that there ends up inevitably being just a ton of designs and a ton of art that just kind of ends up in this weird purgatory that people really like it,
Mhm.
but it's stuff that it's not, for example, like, ooh, I want that tattooed, on my shoulder or something.
Right. Right.
Um, and unfortunately, a lot of comic book art kind of falls into that category when it comes to tattooing.
Mhm.
And so that said, when I have the opportunity to basically see that art given life and like,
Mhm.
you know, put out there and, put in front of more eyes, that that feels good to me,
Mhm.
and yeah, if I make some money on it, great. Um, But at the end of the day, it's the difference between, oh, this art being out there and appreciated, because again, art by compulsion, I'm going to create it regardless.
Right.
Um, but if it can be out there and appreciated, that feels good,
Yeah,
and
okay.
I enjoy that. And actually, kind of a funny thing that I realized after the fact when I was going through the sketchbook that had the original People of Innsmouth illustration,
Mhm,
I had completely forgotten, but I had noticed when I was looking through, I had actually drawn Lady Lovecraft, that initial
mhm,
cover,
mhm,
before I even did the People of Innsmouth.
mhm.
Like that was already an existing thing. And then, yeah, just as fate would have it, it just, you know, ended up seeing the light of day, as it were.
Mhm. Well, and so we name our variant covers when we do them, and I had to come up with some title for it, and I don't know where it came from, but it was just like, "All right, we're calling this Lady Lovecraft," and just
Yeah.
we just ran with it. So, let's fast forward a little. I can't remember when we started talking. I think it was either spring or summer of 2020 when I can't remember whether I approached you or you were talking about it and said, how about if we collaborate on some short thing? Like, I think at the time we were talking like,
Yeah.
maybe 4 pages. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah. The four, maybe max eight
Yeah.
pages.
Uh-huh.
And then yeah, we both got our teeth into that, and that notion went away very quickly.
Yeah, it did. Um, so one thing that I've found from doing comics and just from being a human being is if you ever come across an artist who will say, "Yes, I would like to draw something for you," whether it's 4 pages or 42 pages, the answer is always yes. It's never no, it's
Yeah.
always yes. Um, so what I really remember from that and what I really liked was how we collaborated on the story well before we got to any point where it started taking on a life of its own. You know,
Yeah.
that I came with some ideas and you shot some of them down and you had some ideas, and at some point it became, let's do the story of this woman that we had already done, that you had already drawn and that we had put on the comic. And
Yeah.
I can't remember how we got there, but it ended up really becoming her origin story, like before she became that woman.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the thing that I really liked about that process is you're very good at story and character creation too. Some artists, they don't want to be involved. They just want to say, okay, I want to draw this cool thing. I want to draw that cool thing. But
Yeah.
with when we were talking, we really got into who the character is, what her atmosphere is, what we wanted to do with this story, and really wanted to make it kind of a Lovecraftian haunted house. Is she
Yeah.
crazy? Is she not crazy? Sort of thing. And I remember tossing out some ideas to you that I thought, no way he's going to agree to that. And you just dug into them and were like, yeah, let's do that.
Yeah.
No one is expecting us to do that. Let's do that. So I was kind of curious. I mean, have you had experience creating like story before? And if so, like, or if not, like, how was that experience for you?
Um, as far as like writing out story, because this was actually, as far as I can think of, was actually my first real delving into illustrating a story,
Hmm.
where it's like, okay, this happens, which leads to this, which happens, which leads to this, and so on.
Hmm.
Some of my earliest illustrations and my earliest paid illustrations were actually for Dungeons and Dragons characters, believe
Oh,
it or
okay.
not.
Hmm.
And one of the big things was I would take and ask a bunch of questions about, like, okay, because one of the things I learned from that is if you ask the right questions and you find out the personality of
Mhm.
the personality of the character pretty much informs, how they're going to stand, how they're going to react, how the emotions are going to act upon them, and that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And when we were going over different ideas for Lady Lovecraft, a lot of it for me was, you know, let me understand her as a character,
Mhm.
and then I can illustrate that and kind of flesh that out.
Mhm.
Um, for me, it's kind of the character comes first, and then the illustration is born of that.
Mhm.
Whereas if you just take, like your standard, like, oh, this is a really cool character design standing in T pose,
Mhm.
and there's no meat on their bones, they don't go very far. Like it's
Right.
just okay, it's just a cool character design.
Right.
And I think one of the big things that kind of fascinated me and kind of helped me steer it towards the origin story is
Mhm.
it's always fascinated me when, yeah, you can just have a character and say, oh, this character is really cool, and they're, really tough, or they're really smart, or they're really
Mhm.
this, or they're really that. And you know I think one of the things that I always look at is, yeah, okay, like to use a metaphor, it's like, okay, it's really cool that a turtle has a shell, but
Mhm.
how did it get the shell?
Mhm.
And like that line of logic is kind of what, took me there, and is like,
Mhm.
if she's this cool, we got to know how, we get there, where's
Right.
it start?
Right, and I think that's what a lot of people who do stories sort of miss is they think of these cool characters and they start the story with them and there's nowhere to go. It's like if you have Wolverine, I mean, you're not going anywhere. Wolverine's not going to change. He's going to be who he is. But if you start
Yeah.
off with a normal guy and get him to Wolverine, that's your story. That shit happens to him.
Yeah.
Um, and I think you're absolutely right there. And it's kind of very similar writing as I imagine it is drawing that you have this character, but you got to figure out how they got there. It's much like you talked about the shell. It's like, how did they get that shell? Well, here we have this really weird, interesting woman who is clearly in command of a lot of different things, both practical and magical and things like that. But if we just start with her, there's no place to go. But
Exactly. Yeah.
to find out how a person gets there, that really to me is interesting. That's their story. So what I also liked about it was the where she starts is not what you would expect. Like art, her name is Lilith, Lil as we call her, is a very scared character to start our story. She
Yeah.
really is not this strong, independent woman that she gets to be, and she's really under the thumb of a woman who's like that, who's almost tyrannical. Her
Yeah.
grandmother, and that's interesting to me because you were talking about character design, and if you have this cool character in a T pose, that's great. As a writer, and I imagine as an artist, the thing that makes characters interesting are their flaws.
Yeah.
Like, you know, it
Certainly.
it it's it the flaw in the teapot is the interesting part of the teapot. It's not the rest of it. For her, it's the fact that she's this scared little character who has to go through this story to try to become that woman that is interesting to me. And finding those really unique things and those really unique flaws became interesting. So let's talk a bit about the process that we went through to make this comic. So
Okay.
we had talked about it, and normally I write what's known as a full script, which is,
Mhm.
here's panel one, here's panel two, here's panel three. And when we talked about it, you said, no, I prefer not to do that.
Yeah.
which was cool to me because I had never written what's known as Marvel style, which
Yeah.
is I'm going to just write a stream of conscious story and give it to you and let you determine where the panels are, how many panels are on a page, where the page breaks are, all of that. I got to tell
Yeah.
you, yeah, I was excited about it, but I was also a little scared about it because I'd never done it before. And it was, you know,
I'm used to that from my clients.
oh, okay, well, good. I'm glad you were used to it. So we talked about it, and one of the things that we came up with was the idea of a diary. It really fit in with the whole Lovecraft ethos of, all these characters who are writing their journals or writing these letters at the
Yeah.
last minute before the monster kills them or whatever. And it made it very easy for me to turn it over to you because I knew, okay, she tells in her journal exactly the story. I can give it to you and you can just see it. I don't have to worry about any of the panels or page breaks because you'll figure it out. So
Yeah.
my recollection is we did that very quickly, that, we had the story. We had talked for like a long time. And then when I sat down and wrote it, it was very quick. I want to say it was like a week or two to write that
Yeah.
and give it to you.
Yeah. It was pretty quick.
And then that was sort of it for me. I turned it over to you and you went nuts. So
Yeah.
let's talk about you going nuts because we want to entertain people. So what was it like once you got this basic story and we're trying to figure out how to do
Oh dear. Um,
it?
pretty much to put it in the story of our times.
Hmm.
Um, I think once the story was completed and like everything was like set to go,
Hmm.
um, I'm in Rhode Island and we went into full shutdown,
Hmm.
especially with my job. So pretty much the state told me like, nope, you got to stay at home, can't work, full shutdown. And I think it was like 2 weeks after that happened,
Hmm.
and I think we started talking about getting everything, like getting the story going,
Hmm.
like within a couple of days of me going into full shutdown.
Hmm.
And so I got a hold of this story. I'm basically locked in my apartment. And like again, like all I could think of was, again, like the HP Lovecraft stories, like, Charles Dexter Ward, like, yeah, he's like locked in this office and he's working on this stuff and he's trying not to lose his mind, but
Hmm.
it's gone.
Hmm.
And that was pretty much like the beginning of it. Like I got it.
Hmm.
And like I said, I'd never gone through and actually told a full story before, but I knew, being familiar with comics and being familiar with, tattoos, where a lot of the times you have to tell, you have to kind of tell a whole story in one
Hmm.
snapshot.
Hmm.
So I took that and I said, okay, where, like, this needs to be cohesive.
Hmm.
So I sat down, I think I had like copier paper, like copy paper, just,
Hmm.
8.5 by 11, whatever. And I just frantically took and scribbled and erased and scribbled and erased, um, just page by page. And I figured out, like, okay, in respect of, Lovecraft's work, I'm like, I want to set this up so that if there's like a big, like, not a jump scare, but like if there's
Hmm.
like a big revelation or something like that, like I want you to take and flip the page to that.
Yeah, page reveal.
And I went through, started laying that all out and
Hmm.
figuring that all out, and just basically doing these, like, 8.5 by 11 thumbnails, which is basically like just enough that I could tell, like, where I wanted the characters on the page,
Hmm.
how I wanted them to kind of, set. And one of the big things was that I wanted to make sure that I captured a lot of the kind of that Lovecraft feeling where I did a lot of like really, really tight zooms and a lot of
Mhm.
like really close into faces. And I'm not gonna lie, part of that was I'm not a huge fan of drawn backgrounds, full disclosure.
Fair enough.
But a good bit of that was I wanted to be really, really zoomed in on the characters
Mhm.
so that it would give contrast, much like in Lovecraft's work,
Mhm.
when they realize just how small they are when it
Mhm.
zooms out. And
Mhm.
now all of a sudden you go from like a really tight in headshot to, all of a sudden they're this little tiny thing on the page, like,
Mhm.
and there's just, all this stuff swimming around them and all this craziness going on.
Mhm.
And, I wanted that revelation. I wanted that like, oh, whoa, like, okay.
Mhm.
But yeah, a lot of it was just, figuring out those layouts. And then I ended up going over into, I think it was like 11 by 17, like the comic layout pages,
Mhm.
and just translating everything. And then, at that point, it's like, final edits, like seeing it at full size. I'm just
Mhm.
like, oh, I kind of want to, like it just, I'm trying to think how to put it. There were certain spaces where I was looking at the page and I thought to myself, like, I feel like this panel to this panel is a little bit abrupt. And there's like, so there were certain parts I'm like, oh, like, let me take and, add this in and have
Yeah,
like the, more of the nuances of the emotion so it would, move along more smoothly.
sure. And, like, work
But
on the
yeah,
transitions, things like that.
yeah, yeah. And, but yeah, that was pretty much the, creative processes getting into the penciling and stuff.
Right, one of the you mentioned talking about, like, really being zoomed in on the character, and,
Mhm.
one of the things that struck me when I saw the art was, when the story is very much the journal, so you're in her head the
Mhm.
whole time. And what I really loved about the art was she was sort of at the center of things all the time. So you really felt
Yeah.
like both her journal and the art worked together to show you exactly where you were, where she was all the time. But it's also wonderful in that Lovecraftian sense, in that at a certain point you can tell things have just gone completely off the rails with this girl. And
Yeah.
I love it that the art just dives right off there with her, and you feel like you're going on this journey into madness with her, and it's just all there on the page, and you just let loose. And I remember you talking about it, how at the beginning you were going to be very staid, and clean, so that by the time you got to this point, you were just going to go nuts. And I loved it when it went nuts. Those are
Yeah.
my favorite pages, when all hell breaks loose.
Yeah, the
Uh,
wheels are coming loose.
yeah, and that's the great thing, about comics and comic art, that I think works almost better than just plain text, is you trust the art to represent reality. You're like, okay, what's really going on? And when the art is showing you subjectively what she's seeing, you have to accept it as reality, that this is what's really happening. And so
Yeah.
I love it so much when it goes there.
Yeah.
Um, so one of the things that I really loved about your process on this one was, and we talked about it a bit, was you had done the line work, and then you
Mhm.
went back and we had talked about color and not color, and
Yeah.
ultimately decided to do a really cool grayscale wash.
Yeah.
And one of the things you had mentioned, and it stuck with me ever since, is it's kind of like the pages are stuck in this old New England seaside house and just water is dripping. It's like so humid. The water is
Yeah.
dripping off the pages. And it really feels like that. And I wondered if you can talk about that process at all, like making it or how you decided to do it or anything like that.
Um, Honestly, I had approached the whole thing, and just like any artist, like, now that I'm done with the comic, like there's certain things that, like, I would approach a little bit differently in hindsight,
Sure.
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But the big thing was when I started getting into the shading, and I had done some tests, and I remember anything that I was approaching it and it looked too clean,
Hmm.
it didn't feel right.
Right.
And it didn't feel like that's where we should have gone with it. And I was messing around with different stuff, and I'm like, well, I can take and do this, I can do this, I can, I could go into it with, and shade it with like alcohol markers, or
Hmm.
I could take and do, any one of the various, I could, load it into digital and do
Hmm.
all the shading digitally, um, and all that. And of everything, like I was just like, it's not feeling right. It's not feeling right. One of my big concerns was, when I decided to do like gray washes on it,
Hmm.
I'm like, I want it to have a very, um, like almost like a watercolor kind of feel, like where,
Hmm.
that wet feel.
Hmm.
And did some tests with some watercolor, and it didn't stay as consistent as I would like. And there were some things there where I was like, eh. And then I ended up just getting, and it's kind of funny because one of the issues that I had when I was doing it with water is they take forever to dry. And I was like,
Hmm.
So of all the tests that I did, I ended up coming across just straight up India ink.
Hmm.
And then I actually mixed it with vodka. And it
Yeah.
ended up working really, really well,
Hmm.
because it would soak into the page, but it would evaporate quickly enough that it didn't really warp the pages.
Hmm.
And it gave, and it was thin enough that it it gave that, very kind of wet, damp feeling, and then like areas, and it again was thin enough that, like, I could do like some really, really fine texture, like spatter and stuff like
Hmm.
that. And like, all kinds of drips and all this kind of thing,
Hmm.
without it, chewing up the page
Yeah.
and just, destroying everything.
Hmm.
And I know, that was one of the big things that was like really big to me, was having that feel to it.
Yeah.
I felt that, that was kind of integral.
Hmm.
Um, I know I had done a couple of tests on, basically scanning the stuff in and then adding color digitally.
Hmm.
And I had done a couple of tests. I think I did like the first couple of pages.
Hmm.
I tried doing the color, and I went through and, tried out this very like painterly style and
Hmm.
this kind of stuff. And I was getting really into it. And I was like, oh, okay, cool, cool. And then I remember at that point, I think I still had the physical pages with me.
Hmm.
And I picked up the physical page, like the original, like the full, and I looked at it, and then looked at, the digital color with,
Yeah.
everything laid on it and everything. And I'm like, I feel like despite all the work and despite everything, I was looking at the two side by side, and I'm like, I feel like I've moved backwards. Like
Yeah.
I
That
feel like
something got lost.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'd love, moving forward, to see if there's a way that I can incorporate, more, either more texture or more,
Hmm.
life into the story, or maybe do some, some version of color in the
Hmm.
story. Um, but at that time, like I said, I've looked more into doing color stuff more recently, but at that time, like I just looked at the two side by side and I was like, it lost its soul.
Right.
Yeah, and it's
Well,
like,
and I remember we had conversations about it, and so a couple of things. One thing is I have a policy, which is my job is to write. My job is not to tell the artist what they do. And I have a firm trust that, the artist is going to do the best work that they can. And if they say this is the way it is, that's the way it is.
mhm, yeah,
So when you said that, that grayscale, the grayscale wash was the way to go, I didn't question it. But moreover, because I think I had seen some of the things you had digitally colored,
yeah,
I agreed with you a lot. Like the thing that stands out to me about Lady Lovecraft, and I look at a lot of Kickstarter comics, is it doesn't look like anything else that's out there. You know,
that was one
everything.
of my fears.
Yeah, it's one of my fears too. Is you know, I like digital art. I like artists that put their stamp on thing, but one
Mhm.
of the things that I really notice when people do it is when they do things handmade and you can feel it. And that's something about this comic that I haven't seen in a long time is you can really feel like this thing was handmade. Somebody poured over these pages literally with vodka and made these pages. And when you sent me the pages of art, I have them here and I look at them and I'm blown away at looking at them because you can just see exactly how it was made. And a lot of comic art isn't like that. Somebody penciled it and then the inker came along and inked over it and erased the pencils. And so now it's just this black and white page of art. And it's cool, but these don't look anything like that. These look like
Yeah.
finished pieces that were specifically made to look like this. And I got to tell you, I love it. When we talked about this later, but when I was trying to do the lettering, I do lettering digitally.
Mhm.
I can't hand letter, but I wanted to find a way to capture that handmade feeling when I was doing the lettering. And so one of the things that I asked you to do was go draw me a crap load of bubbles and balloons and
Yeah.
scrolls for the thing so that they could feel like they belong on these pieces of art because I wanted it to feel like a whole. And I think it came through. And I was just chatting with somebody recently about there's nothing else that looks like Lady Lovecraft out there right now. So I think you made the right choice there, and way to go us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember, and it was funny because, I basically thought the same thing if I remember correctly, you had sent me the first couple of, um, pages for lettering, and
Yeah,
it,
the
it
lettering
did. It had
test.
like the
Yeah.
standard clean bubbles and this kind
Mhm.
of thing, and you were like, yeah, and I know we went back and forth on what fonts to use, this kind of
Mhm.
thing. And I I remember looking at it, and and pretty much like you kind of left a lot of the art to me.
Mhm.
When you started getting into lettering, I didn't want to say anything, but I was like, "Mm, okay, okay." And then when you were like, hey, dude, like, can you draw me up some scrolls and the bubbles and this and that? And immediately I was like, okay, like, and if I remember correctly, I went through and I did some different textures on those, and I
Mhm.
did like ones for when certain characters are talking specifically, and because even at that point, I wanted to have like kind of a different feel for
Mhm.
different tones,
Mhm.
but yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, yeah. I remember looking at him like, this doesn't feel right at all. It was probably the same thing you were dealing with the color, which is, you when you find that thing and it strikes you as right, that's
Yeah,
the thing you want to
yeah,
keep going forward and you want to make sure you don't stray too far from that. And I could feel it when I was doing the lettering that it's just like, this isn't right. It's gonna be a pain in the fucking ass that to find do it with these bubbles, but I'm gonna do it because it's gonna be so much better. And I think it is. When I look at it now, I think it works. And one of the things that I really like when a project does it, which is the art feels like the story. So in this case, the story takes place in the 1700s. They didn't have computers doing things back then. They
Yeah,
didn't have, a lot of the technology. And in the colonies that we were basing this in, they they weren't rich with color, they weren't rich with ink, they weren't rich with a lot of those things. It was very basic. If you look
yeah,
at it, it was a lot of woodcuts and drawings at the time that I feel like this is brings you to that place, so
yeah.
I was wondering if you had that thought as well.
Um, certainly. There, I mean, quite frankly, like if if I was capable of doing woodcuts like Dore, this kind of thing, like
Mhm.
I most likely would have. Um,
This would be an
but
entirely different project at that point, but yes.
yeah, yeah. Oh my god. I mean, I've done woodblock prints, but that's a anyway. Moving on.
Mhm,
Um, the yeah, like the big thing was I wanted to within the confines of what I could realistically do,
mhm,
I wanted to give it as much of that feeling as possible and as much of that sense. And I remember even like little things like when I finished inking all the pages, I went through and my initial thought was, oh, like, should I go through and erase all the pencils?
mhm,
And I looked through and I kind of went back and forth and I was just like, you know what? No, like I
mhm,
want to have as much of that there as possible. If I remember correctly, I went through and it was like just like the big like the frame lines where it's
mhm,
just like you'd have a character that'd be like a big line down the center of their
mhm.
face, and like I got rid of as little of that stuff as possible.
Right.
Basically like I just went through and anything that was too in the way and distracting, got rid of
Mhm.
that. But I wanted to leave as much texture and as much of the process in there. And again, yeah, a lot of it was, to kind of get that feeling like it had been, written down in a diary, like this
Mhm.
kind of thing. But yeah,
Right, like she may have scratched these sort of drawings into to the diary itself. Yeah,
yeah,
that's a cool. I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, I can totally see that. So somehow the story that was supposed to be 4 pages inflated to 42 pages.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and one of the things that we ended up doing was there's a flash forward at one point,
Mhm.
and I really like that. And one of the things that we talked about was if we ever wanted to, we could go back and tell more stories about what happened in between then. And
Yeah.
um, I think fans, the people who read the comic will want to find out more about this character. I hope so, but I know I do.
Yeah, that is always the hope.
Yeah, exactly. I remember, and I know that we've talked about it some. Is it's kind of open ended. Where we left it, would allow us to go a lot of different places. And I'm wondering whether you've thought about that more. About are there times when you're just sitting there thinking around, hey, I'll bet she'd end up here at some point, or I'll bet she'd end up doing that at some point.
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh, certainly. One of the things that I had thought about, and obviously, seeing how everything goes, and
Hmm.
um, usually, like any sort of, telling any sort of story, you need an audience.
Hmm.
Um, One of the big things that I thought going into this is like, hey, if this does well and enough people enjoy this and want to hear it,
Hmm.
then yeah, I want to take and continue telling this story. And one of the big, I know we already kind of touched on it, but one of the big things that I always wanted to, kind of avoid
Hmm.
was just having her just drop in the bucket as this amazing character that was super powerful and super this, super that.
Right.
And I really wanted to kind of continue the story of like, what does she go through that gets her to
Mhm.
that point where we see her?
Mhm.
Like at some point down the road, if everything works out, like on the original illustration of her, I had these like Japanese style tattoos coming over her
Yeah,
shoulders.
I was wondering about those.
Yeah, and I was thinking, I was like, you know, super early thought, and see where it goes. But one of my thoughts was like, I imagine like, her at that time, like what happens if she, lands in Japan and,
Mhm.
she's, investigating or fighting or dealing with, crazy like, Oni monsters or,
Mhm.
that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And, ends up, getting these tattoos somehow, some way. And, so there was like, again, just going from
Mhm.
that original illustration, I was just like, this is a story that I want to tell. Like, this isn't
Right.
somebody that's just born that way.
Right.
Um, and I remember again in the original illustration, it was like there was like flowers with eyeballs in them and
Mhm.
tentacles, and it's weird kind of frame and
Mhm.
all this kind of stuff. And again, like it's all kind of things that I thought about, and I'm like, like, wonder how we get there.
Mhm.
So, but yeah,
Me too. I feel like that's the great thing about it is we've created a character and created a world that it's fun to imagine what happens next, you know?
yeah.
And so, yeah, so we'll see.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
go like yeah, like I said, hopefully going through everything, if everything pans out well, and again, like if people want that story, I'd be glad to tell it.
Yeah, me
And
too.
well, basically you tell it, me draw it. And um but yeah.
Right. And no, I'm exactly there with you. I think this is a great origin story. It works by itself if it has to, but it also opens a lot of doors that could be fun to walk through. Um,
Yeah.
and I think fans are going to enjoy it. I think it's a fun thing to tell. A lot of Lovecraft, they follow sort of that idea of Lovecraft short story that it's this thing, something terrible happens, the character goes nuts, goes insane, dies, goes to
Yeah.
wherever, and that's it. And one of the things I liked about this was it's opening a door rather than closing it,
Yeah.
to where it could go. And well, I'm sure we'll hear back from people who once they read the book, if they want more, they'll let us know.
Yeah. And again, that was one of the things that, like, that same feeling in a lot of Lovecraft's work.
Hmm.
You end on this closed door is like, nope, that's it. That's
Hmm.
And one of the things, I know we ended up kind of,
Hmm.
landing on the same thought, was, you know, how about we have this character, she goes through all this stuff, she's left weirder for it,
Hmm.
but ultimately it's not, that endpoint. Like she grows, moves forward, and is weirder for it, you
Right.
know.
Right. And one of the things that I thought was really cool that you were open to when we first started discussing this was no character exists in a vacuum. They exist in their setting, that, where they were brought up, how they were brought up, what the limits are that were imposed upon them. And
Yeah,
one
certainly.
of the nice things about this character was, 1700s New England, women weren't allowed very much. And so
Yeah.
a woman who is going to end up like that drawing, with tattoos, with tentacles, with, eyeballs with tentacles and all of these things, that this is a woman who stepped out of the bonds of her normal society.
Oh yeah.
And as a writer, that's really interesting because once you go off the map, you're creating your own new map. And that's kind of how I envision this character is. She is becoming her own thing, and it's more interesting because of all the people trying to stop her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And certainly that was one of the things, and I know we kind of went back and forth on it. But one of the things is that when we got talking about it, there's
Mhm.
one of the characters that is trying to protect her,
Mhm.
but it comes off as again just very tyrannical protection, this kind of
Mhm.
thing. And one of the things that I really liked was that that character, which is her grandmother,
Mhm.
whatever. Um, you come to find out it's just like she's a very powerful woman in her own right,
Mhm.
and there was a lot of resentment, and there was a lot of hoops she had to jump through to get to where she was.
Mhm.
And I really enjoyed when we were going through the story that yeah, okay, she had all that and she took her own path to get it,
Mhm.
and that we wanted to take have that as some kind of example of
Mhm.
how tough it was to reach that point,
Mhm.
but also not just have a direct like, oh, okay, we're just gonna after everything happens, we're not gonna just take and hand that to
Mhm.
Lil.
Mhm.
There needed to be that build up and kind of stuff, and just like you said, like that struggle in that time period of her having to establish herself and having to go through everything to get that respect.
Right.
And and again, like that's one of the things that I really like sometimes about female characters in general,
Mhm.
when you're talking about period pieces, is just that society doesn't want to let you.
Right.
you know
Right. And I also, when we were talking about it and we talked about the grandmother, and there's a couple other characters,
hmm
we made, I, I I remember having conversations with you where we went back and forth, and we were both very strongly on the point that nobody is perfect and nobody's perfectly evil. It's
yeah,
everybody is sort of this gray line somewhere in between, and you one person can read it and say, oh, this person is terrible, they shouldn't have done it, they were forcing their own thing on her. And another person can say, yeah, but they did it for this reason. That much like the art, it's this sort of gray scale where
yeah,
you can bring to it what you want and you can make your own decisions.
yeah. And that I kind of love that about the way that, like, once we got talking about the way that you wrote the characters and the way
Mhm.
that you kind of delved into that, as far as like yeah, like there's no one character that you can point out and be like, oh, that's the bad guy.
Mhm.
It's like you can look at it and it's like, yeah, okay, this person's got their own thing going on, they're kind of bad sometimes, and this
Mhm.
person's kind of bad sometimes, and then some of it is just overall circumstance.
Mhm.
And yeah, like I always really like that. It's just that it kind of leaves you on your toes, like who's good, who's bad, who's actually got Lil's back, and who's just trying to kind of you know push upon her what they think is best for her.
Right.
So yeah.
Right. Um, One last thing, and
Mhm.
I was talking to somebody about this recently, and so Lovecraft on social media is kind of a polarizing figure. Some people love him,
Yeah.
some
Oh yeah.
people hate him, all kinds of things. And one of the things that I was talking to somebody about was Lovecraft really wrote from his fears. That
Oh yeah.
was, he had a lot of fears. He was afraid of going outside. He was afraid of women. He was afraid of, quite a lot of things. He was afraid of leaving Rhode Island, which,
Yeah.
I've been to Rhode Island, so I don't completely understand that fear, but okay. Um, but one of when we were doing the story, it for me, and maybe I only see it now, is that it's a story about fear. Everybody's
Yeah,
sort of scared of something in this, and how they respond to those fears is sort of what drives the story.
certainly.
And I'm kind of, I think people who like Lovecraft, who respond to horror because it makes you feel and understand fear. I think they're gonna respond to this story.
Yeah, and that certainly that's something that I picked up from your writing, and I
Mhm,
definitely wanted to address that in a lot of the illustrations. And yeah, like there's so much of it where I think almost all of us. Yeah, backtrack just a second. In order for almost any story to be appreciated and to be enjoyed, it needs to
mhm,
be relatable.
right.
And one of the things that I've always noticed with, any sort of, fantastical story, whether it be horror or fantasy or sci-fi or whatever, is you have to have those points of character development where you can relate to the character and what they're feeling.
Right.
And I mean, who can't look through their own life and see some of both the best and worst decisions they've made
Mhm.
and not be able to trace it back to some sort of fear or concern?
Yeah.
Um, and that was really one of the things that, with Lil as a character, it really, like, her coming through that journey, a lot of that is her not necessarily overcoming her fear,
Mhm.
but learning more how to address it on her own terms.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was definitely a thing that, when we kind of hit that point,
Mhm.
I was like, okay, like that's it. Like this is
Yeah.
this is the what feels right for that character.
Yeah, and I think you're
Um,
exactly right, and, you know, to go back to what we were talking about, it's really y you don't get to be this strong, fearless woman from this scared person without addressing your fears some way and learning to live with them, overcome them, on a daily basis. It probably is one or the other. But
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
certainly.
Okay, well, that was pretty much all the questions I had for you. I just want to say thank you. I mean, as I said, as a writer, as a person in general, when you run into someone with talent who can draw better than a stick figure, which is what I can draw, you
Yep.
you say yes to anything that they want to draw. And I want to take this opportunity to say thank you, because this has been a really fun project for me. I enjoyed the challenge of it, doing something different, but also just to see how it came out, because like I said, it doesn't look like anything else. And it wouldn't, if I had been doing this alone, well, A, it wouldn't exist, but B, it wouldn't look anything like this. And that's all due to you. And I just want to thank you for that.
And I'll be honest, man, like I also very much appreciate and want to thank you for pretty much my entire lockdown quarantine time, answering that age old question of what the hell should I draw? That I feel like, that was answered very directly and, you know, turned out really, I feel like it turned out really well. And I'm not gonna lie, like there was much like when you gave me the
Mhm.
story, when I finished up the illustrations, I was also very much looking forward to, getting them back and being like, oh, like this is how he,
Mhm.
laid out the word bubbles and like how he worded everything. And there was even a bunch of stuff where I had drawn in certain things, and apparently, or at least this is how I felt about it,
Mhm.
um, when you got those back, I noticed there were certain parts where you added little things in and little nuances and and yeah, like it like that. I was like, oh my God, like he really got into it and fleshed that out and turned it into like a real narrative and not just a storybook,
Right. And that's one of the joys of doing something Marvel style is you give it to the artist and the artist is going to give you something back and it's not going to be what you expect. And you added some things and I was like, huh, okay, that's an interesting thing to add. I wouldn't have thought of that myself. But then lettering is a really slow process. You
Yeah,
do a page a day, maybe 2 pages a day, beside real life work. And you think about that page all day,
yeah,
and so I saw what you had added to these pages, especially towards the ending, and I was like, okay, I'm starting to see what he was doing. Let me go ahead and start working it into as I'm lettering this. And so by the time I got to the end, it worked perfectly, as sort of a metaphor and theme for the story. And it's like, oh man, that Rob, he's pretty smart.
I don't know. I don't know if I would say that I'm smart, although I won't deny it because that's just bad form. Um, the there definitely were some things that, yeah, like when I was going through the illustrations, little, when you kind of let your mind go a little bit, yeah, occasionally you'll kind of doodle little things that you're like, oh, yeah, oh, I could use that moving
Mhm,
forward. And that was one of the really amazing, great things that I found about illustrating a narrative
mhm,
is just, oh, okay, like I can use these visual cues and these nuances and
mhm,
circle back around to them and that kind of thing. So yeah, yeah,
mhm.
certainly.
Yeah, there's one little panel at the very, very ending on the next to last page where you add in. It's like, oh man, that works perfectly. I love it. So
I
yeah, I
think
mean,
another one you're talking about.
yeah, I think so. And readers will have to figure it out for themselves. Um,
Yeah.
anyway, let me say thanks. This has been a lot of fun. I this was a real great conversation. I think this is the first time I've ever actually heard you speak. So this was cool
Well,
for
I
me.
hope you're not disappointed.
No, no, not at all. I mean, I expected, some, a little bit scarier personality, so I'm kind of a little disappointed about that, but uh, I'll survive somehow.
Yeah, yeah. I work a lot on not being scary. I'm kind of a big tattooed dude, so I don't want to intimidate anybody.
Yeah, probably smart there. You gotta make some coin. All right. Well, let me say thanks, and I will talk to you soon. And yeah, why don't we end there?
Yeah, and thanks right back at you, man. Hey.